So again, hello and welcome to the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site's Fourth Tuesday Speaker Night. My name is Lenora Henson and I'm the Deputy Director Curator here at the TR site. I'm joined behind the scenes by our Programming Assistant, Pat Zarpa. As you may know, the TR site recently wrapped up its 50th anniversary celebration. We are proud to be Western New York's only national park site, although we're actually managed on a daily basis by a local foundation that is also responsible for raising nearly $500,000 each year to keep our doors open. In that vein, I want to say a special thank you to all of the TR site members who are with us today. Your support is very much appreciated. It helps us to serve tens of thousands of visitors each year and preserve the home where the modern presidency began. If you're not yet a member, you can learn more about membership on our website, www.trsite.org. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't also acknowledge the generous financial support of our series sponsor, the New York State Council on the Arts, NYSCA, as well as our numerous annual sponsors. We couldn't bring you this sort of programming without them. The Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural Site's monthly Speaker Night series is our opportunity on the fourth Tuesday of most months to invite experts to help us think more deeply about Theodore Roosevelt, as well as some of the issues that were important during his presidency and continue to be relevant today. In case you're new to our Speaker Night series, I should also mention that NYSCA's support has enabled us to record nearly all of our speakers for the past 4-5 years. It's been a while. So if you've missed any of those, check out our YouTube channel and catch up on those Speaker Night presentations. Having said all of that, I'm honored to introduce this evening's speaker. Award-winning historian David Pietrusza has been called, quote, the undisputed champion of chronicling American presidential campaigns. His critically acclaimed books include studies of the 1920, 1932, 1936, 1948, and 1960 presidential elections, and biographies of Theodore Roosevelt, gambler Arnold Rothstein, and baseball commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis. I hope I said that right. Amazon rated his book, TR's Last War, Theodore Roosevelt, The Great War and a Journey of Triumph and Tragedy, as the #1 new release in World War I biographies. It also captured the Independent Publisher Book Award's silver medal for U.S. history and achieved finalist status for the Theodore Roosevelt Association Book Prize. Pietrusza has appeared on NPR, C-SPAN, MSNBC, The Voice of America, the History Channel, AMC, and ESPN. He has spoken at the JFK, FDR, Truman, and Coolidge Presidential Libraries, the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and various universities and festivals. Pietrusza holds both bachelor's and master's degrees in history from the University of Albany. He has assisted in teaching seminars at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics and at the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. He has served as a guest lecturer at Fordham University, King's College in New York City, and Southeast Missouri State University. He has spoken at the John F. Kennedy, Harry S. Truman, and Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Libraries and Museums, as well as at various universities, libraries, festivals, and museums. A former member of the Amsterdam, New York City Council, he received the 2011 Excellence in Arts and Letters Award of the Alumni Association of the University of Albany, and is a charter member of the Greater Amsterdam School District Hall of Fame. This evening, Mr. Pietrusza will be talking about TR's last war. But before I turn things over to him, I just have one last reminder for our online audience. Please feel free to submit your questions at any point using either the chat or the Q&A function. I'll be back to facilitate our Q&A with Mr. Pietrusza after he finishes his remarks. With that, Mr. Pietrusza, it's all yours. Thank you for being here and sharing your expertise with us.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, even if I'm just virtually here. This is the story of Theodore Roosevelt's last years. It's called his last war, but it's a sort of cryptic title, and it refers to a lot of different wars. It refers to his war against Woodrow Wilson, World War I, trying to get into that war, the war to reunite the Republican Party, the war on his own body, the war against him, where he was fighting so many illnesses and maladies. So it's many different stories all wrapped up in one, which I don't think has been fully told, even by TR's main biographers, because he is not only probably the most interesting American president, he's probably the most interesting American. And so when you get to this period in life, if you're a biographer, you're exhausted by him. He's an exhausting, invigorating, I guess that's a contradiction. He's an exhausting fellow. And so you rush through that if you're a biographer. So I decided to take my time on this and tell this story, in which there's a vignette at the beginning of the book, which is in Columbus, Ohio. But the main body of the story begins upstate. I'm an upstater, you're upstate, and it starts upstate in Syracuse, New York, where Theodore Roosevelt is on trial. He's being sued for criminal libel. He has accused the boss of the New York State Republican Party, who is centered in Albany, a fellow named Billy Barnes, of being as corrupt as Tammany Hall. And Barnes doesn't like this, and he's long since tired of Theodore Roosevelt and decides to teach him a lesson and sue him. He doesn't win. He doesn't win, and he also does something else. He does another favor for Theodore Roosevelt, a big one, because normally Theodore would be hanging out, licking his wounds from the 1912 election at Sagamore Hill. But now he is at a federal courthouse or in New York, in Syracuse, New York, and he is surrounded by admiring reporters. The reporters love him. He's a great story. He's great copy. He'll buy almost everything that they'll buy almost everything he has to say. And what he has to say during that trial, which is not about the trial, it is instead about the sinking of the Lusitania, the British liner this is April 1915, and 1,000 souls have been lost to the torpedoes of a German U-boat, including some Americans. And this absolutely incenses Theodore Roosevelt. Now, when the war started, he was very un-Theodore Roosevelt-like. He was very much saying, well, the Germans had to do what they had to do. We shouldn't jump into this. We should support the administration, the Wilson administration. Privately, it's a totally different story. He's very much an Anglophile. He is not thrilled with the Kaiser. He doesn't like the Kaiser, and he's probably less thrilled with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, meanwhile, is going up to Philadelphia for a speech. He's going to be speaking to a group of immigrants, recent citizens, and many of them are Germans. And he's going to have one line in that speech, which he didn't count on being the memorable line. And that is, sometimes a nation like a man can be too proud to fight. Theodore Roosevelt was never too proud to fight. And he regards this statement in the course of the sinking of the Lusitania to be just absolutely repulsive and not manly at all. What he is going to do is he is now going to go to one of those wars, Theodore Roosevelt's last war. This war is going to be not so much on the Kaiser and Germany, but against Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt had gone back a long way. They weren't close friends, but they had first met in 1890. They shared a platform on civic reform in Baltimore in 1896. Theodore Roosevelt thought that Woodrow Wilson was just going to be a gangbusters president of Princeton University. Admired him a great deal. Wilson, for his part, didn't quite know what to make of him. Occasionally he'd say something nice or think something nice about him, but increasingly he was making these little darts, shooting these little darts at Roosevelt in the press. And so the relationship unravels until finally they run against each other for president in 1912. Now, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt is so busy hating William Howard Taft that he doesn't quite realize how much he hates or will hate Woodrow Wilson, but he soon will. Now, they're going to have differences to begin with. One's Republican, one's Democrat. There's always the tariff. And there is an issue which really tears it between the two of them. And it goes on, occurs before the question of preparedness in World War I. And that is Panama. Theodore Roosevelt took Panama and let Congress debate. And Woodrow Wilson gets into office and proposes a treaty to basically apologize and further indemnify the government of Colombia for taking the Panama Canal and freeing the nation of Panama from Colombian rule. Now, this is not only to apologize basically for America's actions, it's to apologize for Theodore Roosevelt's actions. Roosevelt cannot possibly like that. Neither can he like the fact that when the canal officially opens in 1914, that neither William Howard Taft nor Theodore Roosevelt are invited to the opening. Imagine that. So Wilson is going to exacerbate the issue, the conflict with Theodore Roosevelt, by not engaging in preparedness for war, not building up the Navy. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt always loved the Navy, not building up the Army, refusing to take any sides, sending diplomatic notes to Berlin, and to really have a very confused policy onto what he wants to do in regard to preparing for the war, not preparing for the war. When the Lusitania is sunk, two members of his cabinet ultimately are going to resign. First, William Jennings Bryan, and then the Secretary of War. So John Bryan was the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of War, Lindley Garrison. Now, Bryan was a pacifist. Garrison was for preparedness and was very pro-British. Both of these guys resign almost at the same time. And then what does Woodrow Wilson do? To replace the pacifist Bryan, he puts in the interventionist Robert Lansing, and to replace the interventionist Lindley Garrison, he replaces him with a pacifist Newton Baker. So this is one messed up foreign policy. And Theodore Roosevelt is largely correct to be going against this lack of preparedness, this sort of drift. But Woodrow Wilson catches a break, certainly in 1916, because the Germans are pulling back from confrontation with him. And so it's not just a question of peace for the United States. It's a question for prosperity. And that prosperity is largely fueled because we are the sort of, shall we say, the proto arsenal of democracy. We are shipping all sorts of munitions and raw materials and manufactured goods and money at an interest rate to the Allies. So America is doing pretty well at this time. And let's get back. Let's jump back a few decades more to, what Theodore Roosevelt's attitude is to war. Woodrow Wilson, he's sort of schizo on this again, because it's neutrality in regards to Europe, but what is it in the Caribbean basin? He's intervening in Haiti. He's occupying that country. The Dominican Republic on the other side of the island, same story. And in Mexico, the intervention, the occupation of Veracruz, the invasion of Mexico by General Pershing to get back at Pancho Villa for attacking us, his lack of neutrality in regards to the Huerta administration. But Theodore Roosevelt, you look back to him in the 1890s, and what's he saying? He's saying that, oh, I wouldn't mind if we went to war against Germany over Samoa, or if we could go to war against Britain and seize Canada. It wouldn't be such a bad thing if a European power were to bombard and ruin our eastern cities. That would increase our martial spirit, and that would be great for America. There is no achievement in peacetime which can equal that of that in war. So he has a sort of bloodlust. He has a sort of bloodlust about things. And he also has a problem about what to do about getting back into the political top tier, shall we say. Because when he had crashed the Republican Party in 1912 and elected Woodrow Wilson, he had also crashed his own political influence. The Progressive Party had continued on in 1914. They ran a pretty good slate of candidates. They were not nobodies, but they might as well have been for the amount of votes they get. It is pathetic. Progressivism, big P progressivism, bull moose progressivism is really on the skids in 1914, 1916. But Theodore Roosevelt wants to increase his influence, his power, get back into the White House. But he's got to do that to knit together the Progressive and the Republican parties. And that's not easy. And he doesn't really know how to do it. The conservatives, who have really cemented their hold on the GOP, are still bitter about him. I mean, they would like the progressives to come back. They really would, but they might not want, they do not want Theodore Roosevelt, the great destroyer, to be rewarded by giving him the nomination in 1916. The progressives wouldn't mind coming back, but again, on their own terms, and they don't want to be ruled by the GOP conservatives. So the two parties in 1916, the progressives and the Republicans, have decided to meet at the same time, the very same time, a few blocks apart in the city of Chicago, to come up with maybe a unified slate, or maybe not. The fellow who is the most logical unifier is, again, we go back to upstate, a fellow born in Glens Falls, north of Albany, sort of close to where Theodore Roosevelt was when he rushed down from the Adirondacks to your very building to be sworn in as president in 1901. Hughes was from Glens Falls. Also, what I neglected to mention was one of the first people that Theodore Roosevelt met in Buffalo when he was inaugurated president was none other than Woodrow Wilson, one of the amazing, delicious twists of fate. And that is because Wilson was coming back from a fairly extended vacation up in the Ontario North Woods and just happened to be passing through Buffalo at that time. But back to the conventions in 1916, back to Chicago, back to Charles Evans Hughes. Hughes easily captures the Republican nomination, and Theodore Roosevelt is back at Oyster Bay plotting how best to get the parties back together. And what he's doing is, Woodrow Wilson is very famous for Woodrow Wilson is very famous for throwing people overboard. Former friends, allies, mentors. And what Theodore Roosevelt is going to do in 1916 from Oyster Bay is to throw his really almost like cult followers in the Progressive Party overboard, toying with them, pretending that he might end up as their nominee, might end up as the Republican nominee, might really unify the parties that way. But he has no real intention of running as a progressive again, no real intention of splitting the anti-Wilson Republican progressive vote. And so that year, what he does is, after very much being opposed to Charles Evans Hughes, at first, he does not like him personally. He will fall in to campaigning for Hughes. And I can't think of a situation where the surrogate for a presidential candidate has so overshadowed the actual candidate. Theodore Roosevelt is very much of an issue in that 1916 campaign, and not necessarily in a good way, because this is the year when people are still singing the hit song, "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier." People don't want to get into war. Not when they bought 700,000 copies of sheet music of that little ditty. But with Theodore Roosevelt in back of Hughes, a lot of people are saying, if you elect Hughes, you're going to have TR pulling the strings, and America will get into war. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a tough race for the Republicans to win anyway, because it is a question of peace and prosperity for Woodrow Wilson. Nonetheless, it's a very, very tight race, decided finally by the votes in the state of, a handful of votes in the state of California, and a handful of disaffected progressives who are ticked off at Hughes. Now, what then happens is that Theodore Roosevelt, who has predicted a Hughes victory, much like the people in back of Dewey in 1948, he says, "Oh, Hughes has won," and he makes another one of these TR statements. TR was like the great actress Sarah Bernhardt, who would do these farewell tours. She did, I don't know, 10 farewell tours. And TR was always saying goodbye to politics. "I've lost as mayor of New York. I'm through. I'm probably washed up as vice president. I'm pigeonholed. Maybe I'll go back to law school." And famously in 1904, election night, when he says, "I'm not going to run for another term." So he's always saying he's getting out of politics. He's been very depressed at the beginning of the 1916 campaign. And he says that even if Hughes wins, I'm going to get out of politics. But with Hughes losing, he feels rejected once again. And that's November 1916, which is followed not too long after by April 1917. And Woodrow Wilson, the president who kept us out of war, decides to declare war on Germany after another series of U-boat attacks in the Atlantic, and another incident with Mexico, where the Germans are promising certain American territory, big chunks of it, to the Mexicans if they join in on the German side in case of a US-German war. So Theodore Roosevelt says, "I want to get into this war. I want to fight on the front lines, lead a regiment, just like 1898 again." Theodore Roosevelt has had some health problems already. Certainly became very, very sick on his trip to the Amazon following the 1912 electoral disaster. And but in early 1917, he's done something quite remarkable, which isn't noted very much, but he goes on a fishing expedition. Cue the photo. And this is with a fellow who is named Russell Coles. And Theodore Roosevelt has never done any aquatic fishing before. And this Russell Coles is, who, as you may know this, looks a great deal like William Howard Taft, um, is the big dog on this sort of fishing. Roosevelt decides he's going to do this because, hell, he's Theodore Roosevelt. He could do all these things. And he practices a few times in a rowboat off Oyster Bay in Long Island Sound, tossing a harpoon a few times, goes down to Florida with Coles, and immediately kills the second largest female devilfish, which is a big manta ray, in on record up to that point. And he just is a masterful on this. And Cole's account, written for the New York Sun back in New York, with all this blood in the water, is just one of the most stirring and engaging things one could imagine reading about Theodore Roosevelt. This is peak Theodore Roosevelt. But he follows that up on his way back home to Oyster Bay. He gets off the train in Washington, D.C., and decides he's just going to pop in on Woodrow Wilson and ask him if he can go and raise this regiment and fight on the front lines in France for the American Expeditionary Force. Well, there's a problem with it. Well, there are several problems with this plan, one of which is that Woodrow Wilson isn't home. But with Woodrow Wilson not home, Theodore will go to his home, come back in a week or two. He's still not going to announce his visit, but Wilson has picked up the rumors that he's on his way. They have a fairly pleasant conversation. TR comes away thinking, if it was anyone else but Woodrow Wilson, I'd say I've got the big okay. But in fact, maybe I don't, because it is Woodrow Wilson, and he's right. Woodrow Wilson turns him down, and Woodrow Wilson is right to turn him down. I mean, Wilson is, TR is like 58, 59 years old. He's blind in one eye. He's overweight. He's been sick from the Amazon. His war in 1898 of charging up San Juan Hill is not the war of trench warfare and barbed wires and poison gas and massive artillery barrages of the Great War of 1914, 1918. And so Wilson turns him down. So Wilson has to, or Roosevelt has to stay home, and he wants his 4 sons to get into the war, and he fears that Wilson is going to blackball them. This does not happen. There is a great friend of the Roosevelt family named General Pershing who is in charge, and that helps. That certainly helps. But what also happens is that, well, let's talk about how everyone goes over to the front lines in France. And in the picture here, we see Kermit Roosevelt on the left. He is not going to go over immediately to the American army, and he's not going to go immediately over to France. He joins the British army, goes over to Mesopotamia with them. On his way back from Mesopotamia, he's going to stop off in Egypt, by the way, and make friends with a fellow named Lawrence of Arabia. They have something in common. They're great linguists. And Kermit takes part in the fighting in Mesopotamia, Iraq. And at Tikrit, he comes across, he's sort of wandering around the battlefields, and he comes across a bunch of Turkish soldiers, and he's all by his lonesome, and he doesn't even have a pistol with him. But he, being with the British army at that point, he does have a swagger stick, and he waves this swagger stick at these Turks and says, these Ottomans, and says, well, boys, I think you ought to surrender. And oddly enough, they do. and Kermit lives to fight another day and to fight on the Western Front. Now, seated below these three people is Archie Roosevelt. Archie, as you see, is pretty banged up, and he's going to get very banged up on the Western Front, where his nerves in that arm are going to be wrecked, and he's going to his kneecap. They were afraid they might have to amputate his legs. In that war, he is hurt so badly, and he's going to end the war back in the States, that he is rated, as the government rates these things, 100% disabled. Being a Roosevelt and being made of great sterner stuff, great stern stuff, he's going to go nonetheless and fight in World War II. And he's going to fight in the Pacific, where he will be wounded again and be rated 100% disabled from that war. The only American to be so designated in both great wars. Now, the lady in the picture is, let's see now, I guess it's Ethel Roosevelt. And well, no, I don't think that is Ethel. I think I gave the wrong information. That would be Ethel Roosevelt, and she is the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. She serves as a nurse on the front lines with her husband, Dr. Richard Derby. The remaining figure in the photo is Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who again is wounded in the war, gassed rather seriously, and is, like Archie, is going to fight in World War II. He's going to die on the beach at Normandy, not on D-Day, but he's rated very, very highly by General George Marshall in this World War I for his leadership skills. So those are some, but not all, of the Roosevelts on the Western Front. The other one, the last one, is the baby of the family, Quentin Roosevelt. And while some of these guys were kind of rough or gruff customers, or rather morose, Kermit certainly was, Quentin was the bubbly golden lad, the golden lad they called him. And they thought if anyone could move up on Theodore Roosevelt's footsteps, that it would be Quentin Roosevelt, that he had the right stuff. He, however, didn't have quite the right stuff to get into the Army in World War I. His eyesight was as bad as his father's. He had to literally memorize the eye chart to get in. And also, not long before the war starts, he's out doing a Rooseveltian thing, exploring the Grand Canyon, when a pack horse falls on him and wrecks his back. So he's all braced up, and how he would attempt. Now, what he does is he wants to be a pilot. He was very mechanical. He thought planes were a great thing. Flying in planes were a great thing. How he would see the enemy in combat, or move around in a very cramped cockpit, very problematical. But he is volunteering for combat as an aviator. And frankly, this is the World War I equivalent of being a kamikaze pilot. I've seen a couple of figures on what the life expectancy of a pilot is in World War I, and it's either 11 days or 8 days. In training, they were losing a pilot a month just in crashes in his unit. And he crashes at one point. He flips over, like his plane flips over about 3 times, and he walks away from it. He is in training. Now, again, getting back to Woodrow Wilson's lack of preparedness. Quentin is in training for 11 months as a pilot before he flies for the first time. Why? Because the training is all messed up, because we don't have the planes. We don't have the tanks. that we have to fly French planes. Even though we're making all this stuff for the Allies, we don't have the necessary equipment, and we certainly don't have. We're going to go to 3 million men under arms in November 1918, but in April 1917, our army is 83,000 men, which is a lower number than the casualties in either the Battle of the Somme or of the Battle of Verdun. So very small potatoes army from where we're starting from in 1917. But anyway, finally, in July 1918, Quentin goes airborne against the Huns. And on his first trip out, he gets a kill. Back at Oyster Bay, the family is jubilant. And his mother, Edith, is smashing a wine glass or a claret glass against the fireplace in celebration. But the bill comes due very, very shortly. On Bastille Day, July 14th, 1918, he goes aloft on his second mission, Quentin. And his plane goes down. He's taken 2 German shots right to his skull, and he's killed instantly. Now, no one on the Allied side quite knows that he's shot. They know he's down. Pilots can survive. Pilots can be captured. Pilots can escape. So we don't quite know what's going on. Back at Oyster Bay, there is a message which is received by a reporter brought to TR, which says, "Watch Oyster Bay," and the rest is censored. TR sees this and says, "Oh, this is trouble." It's not Kermit. He's in transit. Nothing's wrong with him. The other 2 in France are wounded. It's Quentin. Do not tell Mrs. Roosevelt. They still don't know what's going to happen, but then the word comes in. TR goes upstairs, tells Edith. After a while, they come back down, and it's all stiff upper lip, and we are so glad our son was able to have this moment of glory and fighting for his nation. But shortly after that, I mean, just a few minutes after that, TR walks over to the stable where he finds Quentin's 20-year-old miniature Shetland pony. And he remembers the relationship the boy and the pony had had. And he kneels down and flings his arms around that horse and sobs and sobs and sobs. He devotes the rest of the war to bond funds, raising money, excoriating the Hun. There's a photo of him in Columbus, Ohio, doing this sort of yeoman's work on the home front. And I'd like to point out a detail about it. And the detail is that generally when Theodore Roosevelt gives a speech, his mode of operation is to put his palm out like that and to smash his fist into it repeatedly. Now watch what he's doing here. He's got one hand on that stanchion. He's got the other hand on the podium, and he's basically holding himself up. Why? Because in 1918, Theodore Roosevelt is a very sick man. He's going to spend 2.5 months of that calendar year at Roosevelt Hospital on New York's Upper West Side. Now, why? In February, he goes in because he's had an operation, not there, but at Sagamore Hill for a cyst. And he does it without anesthetic because, damn it, he's Theodore Roosevelt. But the next day he goes into New York, has a full round of meetings, is in his hotel room that night and begins bleeding all over the couch. They rush him to the hospital. They think he's going to die. And he does not. He does not. But he also says, after a while, as long as I'm here, I've had this problem in my ear from the Amazon. I've had this infection. Could you clean it out? They botched the operation. They botch it, and he's deaf in that one ear. And not only that, but he's lost his equilibrium. So he's lost his sense of balance. He has to learn to walk over once again, once he gets out of the hospital. But then he gets back on that campaign trail, and Armistice Day, November 1918, he goes back into the hospital. He is suffering from great rheumatic pain again. And he comes out on Christmas Day because he insists on coming out Christmas Day. The doctors wish he would stay longer. And he comes out in a wheelchair. And the doctors say, you may have to spend the rest of your life in a wheelchair. At the same time, the Republican Party has learned to love Theodore Roosevelt. The nation has learned to love him once again. And the party, which is so hungry to regain power, is more than willing to nominate Theodore Roosevelt, even though he is just as progressive as he was back in the wild 1912 days. Just before the election, he gives a talk in Maine and says, I will, if the Republican Party wants me, they're going to have to be he actually uses the word radical in terms of what their policies will be. They cannot be the old Republican Party. They will have to be the Republican Party on his terms. Now, he's so sick, and why do people not see this? And I think people don't see this because, damn it, he's been indestructible all this time. You shoot him in Milwaukee in 1912, and he goes on and gives an 80-minute speech. He doesn't die in the Amazon. He doesn't get killed in San Juan Hill. His political career doesn't end in 1900 or 1912. So he seems indestructible, but he's not. He's a very sick man. He has Christmas at Sagamore Hill. As much of the family as he can gather about him in the wake of wartime, he has with him. But then they all leave. And he is just completely racked with pain. He is unable to see visitors. He is unable to sign his own name to a dictated letter. So he goes to bed on the night of January 5th, 1919, and he does not awake. Woodrow Wilson's vice president, Thomas Marshall, is reputed to have said death had to take Theodore Roosevelt in his sleep, because if it had not, because if not, he would have put up a fight. And I'm not quite sure who would have won that fight. And that's the story in a nutshell of Theodore Roosevelt's final years, his last wars, actually. And thank you all for viewing. And if any of you have questions, I'd be more than glad to answer them.
All right, let's see. I'm just gonna see if any of our online audience has questions. Please drop it in the Q&A or drop it in the chat box.
I'll fill in. I'll do a little fill. And when Theodore Roosevelt is turned down by Woodrow Wilson to engage in combat in World War I, he's complaining to Elihu Root, his former Secretary of War, or Taft's former Secretary of War. I think it was his Secretary of State. and says, all I wanted was to be able to go to the Western Front and die. And Elihu Root says to him, did you make that perfectly clear to the president?
All right. So we do have a couple questions in our
Okay.
Q&A. Jackie is wondering, did people see TR's disability and illness as something negative, something to stop him from being president? I guess presumably if you wanted to try and run again.
I don't think so. There is a story that in 1918, a couple of US senators go to visit him. And it's two very conservative guys who would have been death on him otherwise. Boaz Penrose of Pennsylvania and Jim Watson of Indiana. And they come away and Watson says, or Penrose says, we don't have to worry about him. He's not going to run, or he's not going to be the candidate. He's not going to be around very long. And Watson says, how do you know that? What are you talking about? He looked fine. And Penrose says, I come from a very long line of doctors, and I have a sixth sense about these things. And this guy is not going to make it. But Penrose is about the only person who is aware of that. I think if they had known, and of course, the other irony which is going on is that Woodrow Wilson is soon going to have that stroke. And so you've got this string of sickness. Here's something to consider. From Grover Cleveland on to Coolidge, really, you have this string of bad health, death, bad luck in the White House. Coolidge, or Cleveland, of course, everyone in Buffalo would know this, ends up with the cancer and the surgery. Okay. Then Ida McKinley is not well. Okay. And then, well, we know what happened to McKinley in Buffalo. Theodore Roosevelt comes out of it fairly well, but he is hit by a trolley car in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. People don't realize that, remember that. And that's why he can't attend Woodrow Wilson's inauguration as president of Princeton, because he's developed an abscess on that leg. So he has his problems, but he gets out fairly easily from that. Taft's wife, Nellie, suffers a stroke in the White House. Woodrow Wilson famously has a stroke in the White House, but we often forget that his first wife dies in 1914. That's one of the reasons why he can't spend much time or concentrate on the outbreak of war in August 1914. And then you end up with Warren Harding, even before Warren Harding. His wife is sick for months and months, and they think she's going to die. But then, of course, he dies in August 23. So the White House is a place of sickness and death for a very long time. But no, sickness is not considered an asset in getting in. And it wouldn't have been for Theodore Roosevelt if who knows if he could have, from that wheelchair become the first Roosevelt in a wheelchair to get to the White House.
Interesting. All right. Patricia is wondering, who would you compare TR to in the present day?
Boy, nobody. TR is TR. And he's, I guess, would you call him? I don't think it would be called a compliment, but in terms of policy, a neocon. Okay, because he would be so interventionist, and military preparedness and all that. And then on the other hand, he'd be, what you'd call, well, today we're back to calling it progressive again. So liberal progressive, where he wouldn't be conservative one way, but he might be a conservative with a stronger foreign policy. I would say that, again, being so young, everybody in politics right now is so old. Except for Ocasio-Cortez, everyone is so old now, and he leaves the presidency at 50. Let's put that in perspective. Franklin Roosevelt becomes president at 51. This in a way explains why TR is so agitated and get up and go and shaking his fists at everyone for the rest of his life after leaving the presidency, because that's a very, very young time to, you might say the same thing about Bill Clinton, but Edith wasn't about to run for president like Hillary.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like Edith's style at all.
No, but she had, we don't know too much what she was telling him. But we do have a couple of examples. One, she gave him the title of one of his collections of speeches, Fear God and Take Your Own Part. He took her advice on that. And when he, on election night 1904, said he's not running again, she said, that was stupid. Why did you say that? There's a little story about him saying that, or about the consequences of that. In 1912, he has to explain why he's running for president again. Okay, and he says, well, if at breakfast a man is asked whether he wishes another cup of coffee, and he says no, that does not mean he does not desire another cup of coffee for the rest of his life. It just means not now. And so he ran again in 1912. Now, I don't know if Edith would have wanted to stop him or not at that point, but I think she was always really the strong, maybe the adult member of the family in terms of running things. Well, he's off in the Amazon, being a little boy for the last time.
Yep. Let's see. Jackie is wondering, what would you say was the biggest impact that TR had on America?
I think in changing the nature of the presidency to a more activist, where it encapsulated maybe in where he says, I took Panama and let the Congress debate. He, issues all these executive orders, and at one point says that, if the Constitution says I can't do it, then I can do it. Well, actually, that's not the purpose of the Constitution, nor what it was meant to say. But he certainly changed things to being a more activist presidency. Also, I think he gives a respectable veneer to progressivism and to all this era of reform, whereas previously the people pushing this stuff would be William Jennings Bryan, who was not always respected in the better circles, or the socialists, who certainly weren't. But you had this very erudite, adventurous, swashbuckling, but upper class person, respectable in his own Theodore Roosevelt sort of way, giving voice to all these ideas and to making the presidency so much more active. So I mean, he's the guy who really starts that whole train running.
All right, and we have a question from our in-person audience.
Theodore Roosevelt's adventure in the Amazon. how much did America know about this? And how much do they know about how close he came to death and begging to be shot while he was
Oh,
there?
no, he didn't want to be shot. But
He begged for what was the
small
name.
point. I guess the question would be, to rephrase it, would be name your poison. And I think they knew he was very sick. And there's a picture of him when he comes back from the Amazon. And he's got this kind of floppy looking, it's not a campaign hat, but it looks like a fisherman's hat or something. It looks very contemporary. And he looks gaunt. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt is not a gaunt person, okay? And he just looks bad, okay, when he comes back. So they know he's gone through hell. And they can see it, it's written on his face when he's back. But then he comes, he comes back to be really very active. He has certain lingering side effects from that, but they're not really so obvious to the American people. In regards to begging to be shot or begging to die, he was so close to death at that point, and the whole party was in such peril that he thought that if he was brought back by them, he would jeopardize their safety. And he asked his son Kermit. Kermit was the son who would go along with him on these things. And Kermit, and he says, administer the morphine to me. Roosevelt, there or in Africa when he goes on that expedition in 1909 rather, that he would take a little health bag with him, along with about 16 pairs of glasses in case he broke them, that he would take a vial of morphine. And he told the secretary of the Progressive Party, a guy named Oscar Allen, that he always kept that with him in case he got into a fix. And if there was no other way out, that would be his way out. So he was very, very close to a suicide in that way. And that bag and that vial are at Oyster Bay today.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Are there any other questions, either online or from our in-person audience? I don't see any, but David, you're always working on something interesting. Presidents are definitely your bailiwick. Are you working on anything interesting these days? What's your next project?
Well, the next project is, the project which is out now is Roosevelt Sweeps Nation. It's not that Roosevelt. It's one of those many other Roosevelts. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he showed up as a character witness for TR at that Syracuse trial in 1915, and his name was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And this is a story of his 1936 landslide, kind of like FDR's 1904 landslide. And it is about all the very colorful characters who were involved in that campaign in 1936, not only Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor, but William Randolph Hearst and Father Coughlin and the Townsend Plan. And if he'd lived long enough, Huey Long. But some assassins' bullets do not allow you to escape, and Huey was knocked out in September 35. But the election, which was predicted in many cases to be a Landon landslide, Alf Landon, turned out to be just the opposite, and Roosevelt takes 46 out of 48 states.
All right. Well, the other Roosevelt, I guess I guess somebody has to look at him every so often too.
That's
so
right.
We understand that. All right, well, I really want to thank you for joining us today and thank our in-person audience as well as our online audience. As I said, the recording of this will be available in the not too distant future on our YouTube page. And thank you again. Have a wonderful evening to you, David, and our entire audience.